You know, for so long, the story around Alzheimer's has felt, well, a little hopeless, right? Like it's just this thing dictated by your genes and your age. But what if I told you that a huge chunk of that risk is something we can actually get our hands on and change? That's exactly what we're diving into today, the science behind the modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's.
So that brings us to the big question, the one that really matters. How much of this is actually in our hands? How much of Alzheimer's risk is within our control? We're really shifting our thinking here, moving away from this idea of an inevitable fate and looking towards a future where prevention is a real possibility. And believe me, the answer is a lot more optimistic than you might think.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll frame the problem, get a clear picture of Alzheimer's risk. Then we'll talk about the stuff we can't change, our non-modifiable baseline. From there, we'll jump into the good stuff, the modifiable landscape, all the factors we can influence. We'll look at vascular and metabolic factors, then lifestyle, and this idea of cognitive reserve. And we'll wrap up by looking at where all this is heading, the future of prevention.
All right, first things first. Before we can even talk about risk factors, we've got to be on the same page about what Alzheimer's disease actually is.
So, at its core, Alzheimer's is a chronic, progressive neurodegenerative disorder. It slowly unravels the brain. We see this show up in a few key ways: cognitive dysfunction, think memory loss, psychiatric symptoms, and just a growing difficulty with day-to-day life. But here's the absolute kicker. Even with all the incredible research that's been done, the root cause? It's still unknown.
Now that might sound discouraging, but hold on. Just because we don't know the single cause doesn't mean we're in the dark. Not at all. We know this disease isn't random. It's influenced by this really complex interplay of risk factors. And that's our opening. That's where we can find an opportunity to intervene.
Okay, so to really appreciate what we can change, we first have to get real about what we can't. These are the factors beyond our influence, what scientists call the non-modifiable baseline. It's our starting point.
You can basically think of risk factors falling into two big buckets. On one side, you've got the non-modifiable stuff, your age, your genetics, things that are fixed. But on the other side, and this is where we're spending our time today, are the modifiable factors. Think vascular health, diet, and all those lifestyle choices.
So let's drill down into that genetic foundation for a second. First off, age. It is, without a doubt, the single strongest risk factor. The older you get, the higher the risk. Simple as that. Then there's the pure genetics. Now, a tiny fraction of cases, we're talking maybe 1 to 5%, are what's called familial AD. This is caused by specific mutations that essentially guarantee the disease. But for the vast majority of people, we're talking about sporadic AD. And the biggest player there is a gene variant called APOE4. If you have one copy of this allele, your risk roughly triples. 2 copies, your risk can jump by 8 times or even more. But, and this is so important, having APOE4 is not a death sentence. It's a risk factor, not a destiny. It just loads the dice against you. Okay, so that's the baseline, the stuff that's out of our control. But now, let's pivot to the really exciting part, the part that's full of potential, the modifiable landscape. This is truly the arena for intervention.
This life course model from the Lancet Commission is just fantastic for understanding this. It shows that risk isn't just one thing. It's something that accumulates over an entire lifetime. You can see how different factors are more potent at different life stages. Things like education in early life set the foundation. Then bam, in midlife, these vascular risk factors like hypertension and obesity really come into play. And later in life, things like social isolation or smoking become more critical.
And this brings us to a really staggering number. According to the Lancet model, about 35%. Think about that. More than a third of all dementia risk is attributed to these potentially modifiable factors. That is not a footnote. That is a headline. It represents a massive window of opportunity for intervention and prevention. So the big question is, how do we start chipping away at that 35%? Well, a great place to start is with one of the most powerful connections in all of medicine, the brain-body connection, specifically the link between vascular health and brain health.
And this is a message that just can't be overstated. What's going on with your vascular and metabolic health in midlife, we're talking your 40s and 50s, is a critical predictor of your brain health in your 70s and 80s. The evidence is just piling up. What's good for the heart is good for the head, and midlife is when it really, really counts.
Let's get into the specifics because the data is pretty compelling. Midlife hypertension? It's associated with atrophy, actual shrinkage, in the hippocampus late in life. Diabetes? That's linked to brain atrophy in key areas like the frontal and temporal lobes. A high BMI or obesity, that's been connected to lower overall brain volume. And hypercholesterolemia, high cholesterol in your middle years, is a well-established risk factor for dementia. It's not a vague idea. These are measurable, structural changes to the brain. But it's not all about the vascular system, not by a long shot. The choices we make every day, our lifestyle, and how we build what's called cognitive reserve, these things matter immensely.
This table from the long-term CADE study paints a really clear picture. You can see the risk factors and the protective factors laid out side by side. On the risk side, you've got things like hypertension, high cholesterol, smoking, high saturated fat intake. But look at the protective side. High education, physical activity, a strong social network, even coffee consumption. It really drives home this idea of a scale, where our choices can tip the balance one way or the other.
And if you want a really concrete example, check out this quote from the Cardiovascular Health Study. It found that physical activity, just getting up and moving, predicted greater brain volumes in critical areas like the hippocampus 9 years later. That's incredible. It's not just a feeling of being sharper, it's a tangible structural difference in the brain, all linked back to lifestyle choices made almost a decade earlier. So okay, we have all this amazing observational data. We've seen these connections. But that leads to the next logical and crucial step. Can we move from just observing to actually intervening? Can we actively change the trajectory of someone's cognitive health? And the answer is, that's exactly where the field is going. This wealth of knowledge is now being put to the test in large-scale clinical trials. We're taking all these clues and turning them into active interventions to see if we can make a real difference. The absolute prime example of this is the FINGER study out of Finland. It's a landmark trial because it doesn't just target one thing. It's a multi-domain approach. They're looking at nutrition with tailored dietary advice. They're implementing progressive physical activity programs. They're using cognitive and social activities. And all the while, they're carefully monitoring and managing vascular risk factors. It's this all-of-the-above strategy that's really setting the template for the future of prevention research. So, all of this growing evidence really leaves us with a profound and, frankly, a challenging question for the entire field. As we see more and more proof for modifiable risk, where should the balance of our effort and our research funding lie? Do we continue the intense focus on finding a cure, a treatment for those already in the grips of the disease? Or do we pivot more heavily towards prevention, towards tackling that 35%? There's no easy answer, but the path we choose will absolutely shape the future of how we confront Alzheimer's disease.